apologize for them. They are loud, aren't they? They're having one of those big, fancy, boring dinner parties. You know, the kind with enough social machinations, political scheming, and basic lack of adventure to power a Jane Austen novel. Pay them no mind. Okay, hold on. Where were we? Let's see. That's right. The course of the world's history was changed by a woman. Her name was Angelica Blackmore, and she sat on a plush velvet seat on the observation balcony of the HMS Phoenix. Now, the Phoenix was not a ship designed to sail across the ocean, or on a river, or even on a canal. No, the Phoenix was a vessel designed to soar through the sky. They called it an airship, and it was the first of its kind ever created. The Royal Navy had spent 5 years building her. She had a 650-foot long, rigid balloon that was filled with hydrogen, and she was powered by steam. This night, October 21st, 1886, was to be her maiden voyage. Her 65 passengers included members of the peerage, officers, government officials, and a few scientists. They had decided to take the flight in secret that night instead of during the day. First off, because they did not want to arouse the interest of Great Britain's enemies if they succeeded. And second, they did not want to arouse the interest of the Times if they failed. Angelica stared out the window and thought to herself that if Great Britain truly desired secrecy, they might have decided to paint it a color other than white. She looked down and she could see the lights of London flickering around the Thames. It looked like a black snake slithering through golden burning embers. She checked her pocket watch. It was 11:02. She had 3 hours until she would have to begin her assignment. She stared through the double doors into the dining hall where most of the passengers were, and she kept her eyes fixed on Professor Frederick Guthrie, the man she was assigned to. She sat and listened to the gentle ticking of her watch, keeping her thoughts focused on what she would have to do 3 hours from now. A few hours passed, and Angelica decided to check her watch. 1:55. The time for her assignment had come. She stood up and stretched, as much as she could with all the confining finery she was wearing. Then she made her way as inconspicuously as possible through the double doors. She headed for a feeble old man with a bald head and a long beard. It was Professor Guthrie, and he clutched his briefcase next to him as tightly as possible as he leaned against the wall and watched all the people around him. She was glad the professor was so protective over his briefcase. She had been told not to let it out of her sight. She reached the professor and turned to say something to him, when suddenly a muffled noise sounded in the stern of the ship, and the Phoenix jerked. The music stopped, the talking stopped, the dancing stopped. Angelica looked down and noticed in a half-drunk wine glass that all the liquid was pooling toward the bow of the ship. Through the double doors, Angelica could see orange light flooding through the windows of the overlook balcony. The Phoenix was on fire. Suddenly, the Phoenix lurched, and Angelica's stomach dropped. The Phoenix was losing altitude, and fast. Mayhem and panic erupted in the dining hall. Passengers ran back and forth, screaming. Most of them headed for the exits, but what good are exits on an airship that's in the air? Angelica turned toward the professor and grabbed his arm. "Come with me," she said, "now." She led the professor around and through the hordes of screaming people toward the double doors that were led to the overlook balcony where she was. Unfortunately, just as she reached them, they slammed shut. She reached the handle and tried to pull it, but it was locked. She and the professor were stuck inside a room that was about to become a fiery inferno. "Get back," Angelica said to the professor. She flicked up her wrist and out sprung a 3-inch long slender dagger. She thrust the dagger into the lock and jiggled it just a bit. Finally, the lock released. Angelica lowered her wrist and the dagger retracted back into its spring-loaded sheath. She flung open the door, grabbed the professor, then she dragged him to the overlook balcony. Unfortunately, the floor of the balcony, which was once level, was now at a steep incline. Chairs, tables, rugs, plates, everything came barreling toward them. Angelica managed to avoid a few pieces of furniture, but finally the bench, that bench she had been sitting on just a few minutes earlier, barreled into them. Angelica and the professor fell to the floor, and the professor released the briefcase. It started to slide to the bow of the ship. Angelica got to her knees, leapt, and grabbed the briefcase. She looked up. They were only 5 yards away from the window, but the professor was too feeble. She knew he'd never make it. She crawled over to him, took her shoulder, and jammed it in his backside, and continued to push him toward the window. She knew it was very unladylike, but at this point she didn't care. Once they reached the window, she took the briefcase and handed it to him. "Here," she said. Then she flicked up both of her wrists. The dagger shot out. With 2 swift jabs, the window shattered. She wrapped her arm around the professor's waist and said, "We have to jump." The professor pulled away. He pointed out the window and said, "We can't jump. The ground's over 100 feet away. We'll die." Angelica pointed to the dining room where a ball of fire was heading toward them. "We'll die if we don't jump," she said. She hurled herself out the window, taking with her the professor, his briefcase, and his very shrill holler. Angelica's feet hit the ground and she stopped her momentum with her bare hand. She released the professor. He fell down, looking both elated and bewildered that they had survived such a high jump. Angelica reached down, she grabbed his hand, she pulled him up, and the two of them ran across a field away from the burning skeleton of the Phoenix, which careened to the ground with a massive explosion. Heat enveloped them. Burning ash and debris fell from the sky. Angelica could hear the shrieks and the screams of the passengers still trapped aboard the Phoenix as it burned to the ground. Black smoke surrounded them. It made it impossible for Angelica to move forward, but it made it quite easy for her to complete the next parts of her assignment. Suddenly, a piece of debris sailed through the air. It hit Angelica on the head, and she fell to the ground. She sat on a plush velvet. Really? Velvet? Who sits on a velvet bed? And she sat on a plush velvet seat overlooking something. A few hours passed, and Angelica decided to check her pocket. The Phoenix listed. I feel like I'm on a Star Trek set. "Come with me if you want to live," she said. I mean, seriously, what do you expect me to do with that line? She flicked up her wrist, and out shot a 3-inch long, thin. She flicked up her wrist. And I don't remember what she does next, because I've said this line so many times, I'm so sick of it. All right. Unfortunately, the floor, which had been level, you know what that would, oh, totally getting vague here. The ground, which was, it was the floor, big difference. Oh, I forgot my gloves. With 2 swift jabs, no, I was almost there. With 2 swift, glass shattered. All right, here we go. I don't know what happens next. Something bad. Oh yeah, the Phoenix crashes. Angelica's feet hit the ground and she stopped her momentum with her bare hands. And if you haven't figured out she's a superhero yet, you're really slow.